The VOC was established in 1602 as a chartered company whose goal was to trade with Mughal India, where most of Europe's cotton and silk originated. Quickly, the Dutch government gave it a 21-year monopoly on the spice trade with South Asian countries, and the company took off from there. Sounds nice and simple, but the VOC soon became the first conglomerate company, a fancy way of saying they did many different things, like shipbuilding, slave trading, and colonization under the same company name. In the early 1600s, the VOC became the first company listed on the stock exchange. Along with its worldwide reach and transnational employees, it is among the reasons the VOC was a forerunner of modern-day multinational corporations. The VOC had powers that a corporation today would hopefully never have. It could wage war, take and execute prisoners, coin money, negotiate treaties, and establish colonies. It did all of this. As much as modern-day corporations like Google and Shell have way too much power, the VOC was a whole different level. The VOC started operating in India and South Asia in general. Over the next century, it expanded its operations to Mauritius, South Africa, Indonesia, Taiwan, Japan, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam. Not all of these locations were the sites of permanent settlements or even permanent trading posts, but listing them all here gives us a sense of how massive this company was. How did such a transnational company work in the age before instant communication? It was, in fact, far more than a company, it was also a war machine. The VOC was ostensibly founded after a Dutch ship returned from Southeast Asia filled with very profitable spices in 1596. What was going on in the Netherlands that would have made this massive company worth investing in? Put simply, the Netherlands was under threat. It had just declared its independence from Spain in 1581, forming the Dutch Republic. Quite an ambitious move, considering that the Spanish had the force of half of Europe behind them, considering how much of the continent they controlled at the time. Given this vulnerability, you can see the advantages of drawing wealth from outside the tiny Dutch Republic and using it to shore up the newly established country against foreign control while, of course, controlling other countries, but we're not talking about morality or even ideological consistency here. The VOC is considered the first modern multinational company and first made use of many of the features we associate with modern corporations. Think shareholders, corporate identity, legal personhood, separation of ownership and management, etc. This collection of innovations meant that the VOC could mobilize wealth so that only monarchies could before, giving it the sort of unprecedented power we see massive companies like Google and Shell making use of today. When it comes to acquiring this wealth, the VOC was also innovative. It formed Amsterdam as the financial capital of the contemporary world. By allowing public members to invest in the company rather than in things the company was doing, as had been the previous methodology for gathering money. A massive company like the VOC naturally attracted attention, and because of its dominance in international trade, that attention was mainly negative. It got into conflict with the British East India Company for obvious reasons. They were both going for the same thing. Because of the weird space the VOC occupied, part company, part state, its trade objectives often aligned with military goals. For example, in 1667, when the Treaty of Breda was signed, ending the war with Britain, the VOC acquired sole control over the nutmeg trade. Wars also played a role in the colonization of different areas. In South Africa, a prolonged, low-level conflict with the local Khoikhoi population eventually resulted in Khoikhoi society breaking down and expanding European settlements in the area. There were 3 wars between the VOC and the Javanese in Indonesia, and in 1641, they took control of Malacca from the Portuguese. One of the problems about the VOC is that people in the Netherlands aren't sure what it was. A business, a force for colonization, a slave trading enterprise, a force for bureaucracy in the world. The truth is that it was all these things and more. In the Cape, colonization took place over almost 2 centuries. At first, Dutch settlers in South Africa were outnumbered by the local Khoikhoi population. For context, there were 200 Europeans and about 20,000 Khoikhoi. At first, the local people accepted this minimal presence. The settlement at the Cape acted much more as a trading hub than a colony. Slowly, though, the VOC's plans for expansion became apparent. Their transportation of slaves to the colony was just one symptom of their plans to settle a large colony of Europeans there. In the 1660s, conflicts broke out between the Khoikhoi and the Dutch burghers expanded their farms outwards. The Khoikhoi were defeated by the arrival of smallpox in South Africa. The disease arrived in 1713, and it killed off 90% of the Khoikhoi. By the end of the 18th century, Khoikhoi society had disintegrated, and 20,000 Europeans were living in the Cape. In 1795, the British ceded the territory when Napoleon invaded the Netherlands during the Napoleonic Wars. At the end of the wars, the Netherlands formally handed over the Cape Colony to the British, whose colony it remained a part of until 1931. Colonization in the Dutch East Indies is an intriguing topic because when you boil it down, true, colonization of the area only began once the VOC failed financially and was nationalized in an attempt to save it. Territories that had belonged to the VOC became part of the Dutch Republic's territory, but this doesn't mean we don't consider the colonization that was taking place before the nationalization process. For example, in Jakarta, then known as Batavia by the Dutch, the VOC grew cash crops there in the early 17th century. We can see this as a clear move from trading in the spices they had a monopoly on to growing crops they could also profit from land that was not theirs. The VOC also took over the surrounding territory to safeguard these crops, increasing their power in the area. By the late 17th century, the VOC had become deeply embroiled in the internal politics of Jakarta, despite their initial intentions not to get involved in domestic affairs. They encouraged divisions between the different kingdoms in the Indonesian archipelago. Again, you've undoubtedly heard of the phrase, divide and conquer, before, and took part in 2 wars against the kings of Mataram and Banten. After the VOC collapsed in 1800, the trading posts and colonies in the Indonesian archipelago became nationalized as the Dutch East Indies. The VOC also took part in slavery and slave trading during its 200 years of activity. It exploited workers in the East Indies, sometimes engaging in slavery from its inception. However, its use of slaves picked up when it took control of the Cape in South Africa. After realizing that the backbreaking work of establishing a settlement there would need to be done by slaves, the VOC deliberated over enslaving the local Khoikhoi population, which vastly outnumbered them. When they determined that if they annoyed this group, they could easily be kicked out, they decided instead on importing slaves from Mauritius and the Dutch East Indies. For much of the 17th century, the number of slaves in the Cape remained low, about 1,000 at a time. Slaves mostly were taken from Ceylon, Madagascar and Malaya. Because the population was mostly male, it had to be constantly renewed with new slaves. In the 18th century, this number jumped to about 17,000 as the international slave trade increased. Most of the slaves in the Cape came from either East Africa or the VOC's territories in the Dutch East Indies. Slavery was also part of how the VOC operated in the Dutch East Indies, but the story there is more complicated. In their operations in South Africa, the VOC specifically transported slaves from other regions to exploit while building their colony. The VOC mainly used local slaves or slaves from the area in Asia. Moreover, some of these slaves would have been already enslaved by their local community. But the presence of the VOC heightened the demand for slave labor, so just because slave labor was part of life in some Asian countries before their existence, the VOC is not absolved of guilt. Given that the VOC was so big, you would imagine that its end would have been quite catastrophic to the status of the Netherlands worldwide. You might also wonder what happened to this company to make it collapse in 1800. After all, controlling a lot of the spice trade gives a company a fairly hefty advantage. There were many problems with the VOC's operation in Asia, some of which were advantageous to it earlier. However, as time progressed into the 18th century, cracks began to show in the VOC's commercial prowess. In contrast, the British East India Company would trade directly between Europe and, for example, China. One problem was that it brought all the goods it traded between Asia and Europe first to its trading posts in Asia to be sorted or stored. This meant that other companies were making faster journeys and providing fresher goods. This was an advantage for the VOC at the beginning of its trading journey because they had a better understanding of Asia commercially in a centralized place than their competitors did. Another problem was its staff. The VOC was, frankly put, a terrible employer. Like many modern-day multinational companies, it offered low wages. It forbade its staff to engage in private trading, meaning they had no opportunity to increase their wages legally. Of course, many of them did. The VOC suffered huge amounts of corruption among its employees, mostly because making the journey to Asia wouldn't have been financially worth it for them without this extra income. The financial bounty had to be good because we're talking about a fairly dangerous time for traveling the world. War, illnesses from different parts of the world, malnutrition, and some nice venereal diseases killed plenty of VOC staff. Finally, there could be termed a mathematical problem. the VOC paid its shareholders dividends over the profits they made from 1730 onwards. Let's say that again. The VOC decided to pay its shareholders more than it made. I am not a businessperson, but this is unequivocally a bad idea. What this meant in practice was that the VOC did not have enough liquidity to finance its operations for the last 70 years it was active, it relied on short-term loans to do so. Eventually, things would have to change. And they did, but not in the way the VOC might have hoped. In 1780, the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War began, and half of the VOC's fleet was destroyed. Furthermore, the war weakened the VOC's control of the Asian trading posts. The VOC was a complete financial mess after the war, as was the Dutch Republic, which didn't exist for almost 30 years after the Anglo-Dutch War ended. From 1799, the VOC's contract was not renewed, and it ceased to exist. After the Congress of Vienna in 1814, some of the Netherlands' territories in Asia were returned to it, and these became colonies of the Netherlands. As a historian, I firmly believe that it's wrong to ignore how things in the past have shaped the present day. The VOC was a huge part of how the Dutch Republic functioned for almost 200 years. Today, it affects the national image of the Netherlands and the people who make this country up. It also affects what we have in our museums and what lines the national coffers. As we move into an era where colonialism is happily viewed as a negative thing, the image of the VOC in the Netherlands has become complicated and fraught with conflict. In 2006, the then Prime Minister Jan-Peter Balkenende coined the term VOC mentality in a speech about Dutch commercial thinking and innovation. Many people were offended by this association of the VOC with purely positive characteristics, without acknowledging the harm it caused over its 2 centuries of operation. In general, the Netherlands' colonial history has received much attention over the last decade. From the annual Zwarte Piet debates to the Mauritshuis decision to take down the bust of its colonial founder, the country is slowly, very slowly, coming to terms with its past. Museums have begun returning stolen objects to their countries of origin. Universities have started the complicated process of decolonizing their curricula, and the Amsterdam Museum has decided to drop the phrase, Golden Age, from its permanent exhibition texts. The relatives of colonial victims in Indonesia will be heard in court.